Oh, no. Dear speakers and participants, may I have your attention? Please find your seats ASAP as we will begin in 2 minutes. Yeah. Right. Welcome back, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today. Welcome back those joining online too. As we commence, I want to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australian, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people from whose traditional lands the ANU campus rests, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to session 6, the new urban landscape. I'm Nisa, a cultural anthropologist at the School of Culture, History and Language, College of Asia and the Pacific, the Australian National University. I hope you enjoyed your morning tea. I hope you feel more energized after having your tea and coffee. Right, as you can see from our program, the session will feature presentations from 3 wonderful speakers. We have Corry Elyda, Ian Wilson, and also Rita Padawangi. And before the presentations begin, allow me to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Corry Elyda. Corry Elyda is a freelance writer and also self-taught urbanist. She studied English literature at Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta. Her passion for urban issues began during her time as a journalist at the Jakarta Post. After 5 years in journalism, Corry embraced a new challenge in urban and spatial planning policy. She became a project manager at the non-profit organization Jakarta Property Institute, which focuses on affordability and livability issues in Jakarta. Currently, she balances her role as a freelance writer with running her family's business. Sounds like a very fun project. It's now my pleasure to welcome our very first speaker, Mbak Corry Elyda.
Thank you, Mbak. Good morning, everyone. I would like to say thank you for Indonesian Update, especially for Ad and Amalinda, for not only the opportunity, but also for the guidance. So I can stand here to share some stories about Jakarta's neighboring city, South Tangerang, the home of middle class. Maybe some of you have heard about South Tangerang, or often called Tangsel, for its big housing complexes such as BSD City or Bintaro Jaya. As you can see from my title, the presentation will discuss about how middle class who live in gated communities provided and served by private developers, like in BSD and Bintaro, feel more like a consumer rather than a citizen. So how does it happen? As we all know, that the urban population in Jakarta and other big cities is increasing over the years. However, the increasing number of working force is not balanced with the number of the decent places of living. The government doesn't really do anything, actually. No control over the land price and no supply for the middle class. Because having a home in a city center is already out of the questions, the workers who already work for a few years or getting married, usually first home buyers, will look for an alternative. The areas that farther than Jakarta but have access for commute daily. South Tangerang is one of the choices. Here's when private developers come to the pictures to take the opportunity, of course. They usually acquire massive lands of lots in the areas. And to catch the middle class market, they built gated communities to ensure safety and give the sense of exclusivity, as well as flashy infrastructure, such as for public facilities. So middle class who move out from Jakarta will still feel like living in Jakarta. The question is, what are the implications of this massive development of the gated communities in the urban areas? I will discuss how the development creates infrastructure and public facilities gaps in the areas developed by the developers and the ones that are taken care by the local government. And I will also discuss about the impacts of these gaps, which are creating political and socio-economic gaps. Okay, why bother move out from Jakarta? Of course, we cannot afford it. There are two factors, push and pull factors. The push factors is Jakarta doesn't have adequate supply for all the residents. It currently suffers from 1.38 million of housing backlog. And Jakarta is also unaffordable. As you see in the graph, from the property price to income ratio, Jakarta is even more expensive than expensive cities in the world, like Paris, London, Singapore, and Tokyo. So if you have a house in Jakarta, you're like super rich. Meanwhile, the pull factors is the type of the house. This is very important for Indonesian. The only affordable option for middle class in Jakarta is apartment. However, apartment is not attractive at all. The first one, most affordable apartment in Jakarta has small rooms. For example, 25 square meters with 2 bedrooms. Imagine that. The second one, the ownership of the apartment is also temporary for only 80 years. The third one, which is the turn-off for many home buyers, is there are many legal cases, such as stalled development, violation of tenant rights, refusal of management handover, embezzlement, high cost and maintenance and services. My job in my previous office was to advocate people to live in vertical housing, but I personally chose leaded houses. And the last one is, unless you buy the expensive ones, the design of apartment in Jakarta is just sad. Yeah, many people who have tried to live in apartment feels like secluded and claustrophobic. And then, therefore, many young middle class still prefer landed houses, no matter how far it is from the city center. Landed houses are more familiar, although small, you still can build more with the remaining land plot, permanent ownership, still know your neighbors, although they rarely chat, actually. And the concept of having a small garden to do during weekend is kind of American dream with a white picket fence for young middle class in Jakarta. The other full factor is, of course, mobility. Tangsel has both public and private transportation infrastructure, commuter line, and toll roads. Especially for the commuter line serving Jabodetabek, it is being reformed in 2014. It becomes more reliable public transport. Now let me introduce South Tangerang. The city of residentials. As Pak Mustafa said, autopilot city. It's located in South and West Jakarta. South Tangerang is a new city. It's way younger than its housing complexes. It's kind of teenager now, so 15 this year. With the size of 164.8 square kilometer with the population of 1.8 million. It just had 3 mayoral elections, and all are won by Ratu Atut dynasty, an infamous political dynasty that rules Banten. Who doesn't know them? It is a home of 3 big housing complexes, Bintaro, BSD, and Alam Sutra. I will only discuss BSD and Bintaro and other smaller complexes, because Alam Sutra is the upper class. So we can leave them alone. So I will show you, very shocking pictures. This is what South Tangerang looks like. It has 1,160 housing complexes. You know the yellow one? They're all residentials. Yeah, you can imagine. Their biggest revenue is from building transfer fee taxes. The yellow stripes are residential, and the black one is commercial services. Now I will introduce you to the gated communities. The first one is Bintaro Jaya. Somebody live in Bintaro, I believe. Bintaro Jaya was one of the oldest housing complexes founded in 1979. It is divided by sectors in 1,000 hectares of land plots. Aside from one of the most prestigious housing complexes, as it is the closest one to Jakarta, Bintaro is also well known for its high quality schools. As the house is getting more expensive and affordable, Bintaro Jaya now is an aging community. So Pak Herman doesn't have young friends, I believe. But they built some apartments to cater younger buyers. The second one, and the biggest one, is BSD City. It's intended to become not only housing complexes, but a full-fledged city in Indonesia. It is founded in 1989. If Pak Bidin Kus know that it's the start of neoliberalism of housing supply, this is the monument, I believe. BSD encompasses of total around 40,000 houses, with a total number of population 450,000. It's head-to-head to Canberra, right? Canberra is about 400,000, right? So you can imagine how big BSD City is. And Sinarmas Land, the developer keep acquiring land and building. They expanded to Tangerang Regency right now. Besides its completed facilities, BSD is well known for its modern grocery markets, Pasar Modern, and private university. Even Monash University franchise is in BSD. So you get very familiar. And the rest is, we call it free riders, not me, the urbanists, who invented the words. Free riders is the term urbanists created to explain the phenomenon of many smaller housing complexes around Bintaro and BSD. They're massive and will keep mushrooming over the years. Between 2008 to 2014, South Tangerang government gives at least 450 permits for these housing complexes. They are typically small gated communities consisting less than 15 houses, enclave in kampungs, and this developer will use the facilities in Bintaro and BSD to market their units. Smart, right? This is one of the free riders, This is built by Ciputra, it just built. It's near Bintaro. It started from 1.5 billion, if you're interested. And this is what South Tangerang looks like. For its residents. Believe it or not. So who lives in Bintaro and BSD, you are fine. This meme actually explains everything about the infrastructure and public facility gaps. And it's viral in 2020. Some of the candidates use it for, for the campaign. And this narrative often becomes a joke and a discussion in social media and daily conversation. Another term they use is public and private tangsel. And I think this meme depicts everything. I will show you some of the examples of these infrastructure and facility gaps. This is an obvious one. This is Pondok Ranji train station. And this is also Pondok Ranji train station. The difference is the entrance door. The left one is connects to the non-gated communities, And the right one, obviously, to Bintaro. So this is private and public Tangsel in one picture. And also the other one is roads. BSD and Bintaro roads are typically big, well-maintained, while outside are smaller, disorderly, and usually takes time forever for the local government to fix it. The traffic light in the right picture is not function. It's a miracle there's no traffic accident there. The other one is water, the very basic. While Tangsel government sell raw water to BSD and Bintaro to spoil their residents with tap water, yes, tap water is a luxury in Tangsel. The coverage of tap water outside these two is only 12%. Yeah, it's far. These are a few of infrastructure gaps that I can easily show by pictures and graphs. However, the gaps are all in kinds of infrastructure and public services, including schools, hospitals, even markets. The superiority of the facilities provided by giant developers in BSD and Bintaro has resulted a perception among middle class who move to Tangsel. They do not need the local government, as long as their daily needs catered by the private management. The ones who live in free rider communities also think that the same. As long as they have access to the facilities in BSD and Bintaro, they're safe. Some do not even bother to change their IDs to Tangsel IDs. One of the residents said, "I'm not a citizen. I'm a consumer who lives in BSD. My relations are between consumer and developer. I do not have the sense of citizenship." And this statement strengthened by low political participation. In 2020 mayoral election, the participation of Tangsel eligible voters is only 60%. It increases by 4% actually from the previous general election, but still low. Hence, although Tangsel has high human development index, it's not correlated positively to the political participation. During the research, I found 4 types of gated community residents. Type 1, do not have South Tangerang ID. Type 2, have but do not vote. Type 3, vote but do not care. Type 4, vote but pessimistic. Because why? Yeah, because of the Ratu Atut dynasty. Which one are you, Pak Herman and Pak Mustafa? Number 1, okay, Pak Herman is number 1. Okay. The data shows the low voting participation in voting stations whose eligible voters are in gated communities. Most of them are below 50%. This one is in the Latinos, one of the biggest gated communities in BSD. In Bintaro, where Pak Herman lives, it's even worse. They are below 40. Meanwhile, for comparison, I took a random sample of voting station in one of the poor communities in Tangsel. It's in Cipecang, one of the landfill area. Their participation is quite high. It's usually at least 60%. Beside the political gaps, I also want to discuss about social and economic gaps. The existence of middle class, of course, will create gentrification. However, there are other impacts that occur. One of the social economic gaps that I want to highlight is related to social cohesion or the lack of it. Living in a new place, gated community is convenience for the home buyer. When crime happens, which is not foreign in Tangsel, they will tighten up the security and gated complex even become more gated. However, there is a price for this security and exclusivity. The middle class live in a very tight bubble that doesn't have room for them to socialize with people from the kampung, aside from the transactional relationship. The workers in gated are usually from kampung. They also restrict outsiders, and street vendors should register and get approval before entering the compound. Submitting IDs become more and more common. As you can see in the picture, although they have portals outside the compound, the house will have the fence. So it's double security. Another example of socioeconomic gaps is private school versus public school. The middle class in gated communities rarely put their children in public schools. They do not even bother to survey. They usually already have stereotype or rumors from neighbors about certain schools, such as supper quality and bullying cases. Many are not worried that their children do not interact with more diverse children, but some woke parents choose public parks for their children to interact with children from kampung. Schools are too risky for them. You can tell from the pictures, right, which social class of parents from their motorbike. This is a public school, and this is private school. There are many reasons why they put their children in private schools. The main one is for the quality, of course. However, a parent complained that the expensive price they pay is actually for bare minimum. However, as the public school is subpar, she still prefers private school. So, in conclusion, with all the facilities and infrastructure gap, middle class in gated communities may feel comfortable to live in their bubble, but they also think that they will not be affected by the poor quality of local government because their lives are accommodated by developers. However, private entities, nature is seeking profit, and urban issues mostly cannot be resolved partially. So when a brief rain causes flood, housing complex streets is congested, and motorized delinquent gangs are rampant, who's gonna voice the concern? Without the awareness of the citizens, especially middle class, who usually have knowledge more critical to monitor the local government, vote rationally, this problem will only get worse and spread out. Yes. And when your bubble bursts, will it be enough to only become a consumer? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mbak Corry. So if you have a house in Jakarta, you are very rich, especially if you have a house in Jakarta Selatan, anak Jaksel, or Menteng, or BSD, as Mbak Corry mentioned. Right, now, I'm now pleased to welcome our second speaker, Ian Wilson. Ian Wilson is a senior lecturer in politics and security studies and a research fellow of the Indo-Pacific Research Center, Murdoch University. His research is focused on contemporary Indonesian politics and society with a particular emphasis on the political economy of urban social movements and the relationship of political violence and coercive capital to emerging forms of social power. And he has authored 2 books, The Politics of Protection Rackets in Post-New Order Indonesia, and also Politik Tenaga Dalam. That's very interesting. Along with, of course, numerous articles and book chapters. Please join me in welcoming Ian Wilson.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to the update. My paper starts from, let me see if I can get this right. Started from a simple question: what does it mean to be secure in contemporary Jakarta? Well, of course, there's no simple answer to that because security isn't a fixed thing. It depends who you are. It depends where you are in the city. Security is very much a contested idea, and that's particularly so in cities, any city in the world today. Security and risk have become really central to how cities are planned, how they're built, and how they're governed. And the way that security politics or practices unfold will have distinct implications for different kinds of people. The gates and portals that Corry just showed before make some people feel safe, but to other people, they represent exclusion. They prevent entry. They create kinds of social orderings of different sorts. This is, I think, a particularly salient point in the context of Indonesia, where security has really functioned often as a euphemism for political order and a kind of a way of either disciplining or co-opting different kinds of social groups within society. What I'm going to do with this, I have done with this paper, I have written a draft, by the way, with this paper, is to look at the intersection between changes in the urban landscape in Jakarta and different kinds of security practices. And I've talked about these in two ways. One is vertical security and the other is horizontal security. Before I get to that, I wanted to sort of set both a conceptual and a historical context for the discussion. I've been engaging with I think, a really useful idea from the economists Jayadev and Bowles, who talked about what they called the rise of guard labour. And guard labour they describe as, and I'm quoting from them here, those engaged in protection of private property, enforcement of claims on resources, and maintenance of distributional advantages in society. They call this, in classic Marxist terms, unproductive labour. And their observation, which was initially drawn from the United States, was that there's been a strong correlation between the proportion of workforces engaged in guard labour and forms of socioeconomic inequality. So they estimated that in the contemporary United States, for example, 3 out of 10 people in the workforce are engaged, broadly speaking, in this guard labour. They also argue that patterns of urbanisation very much shape guard labour economies. Concentrations of capital, forms of spatial segregation, gated estates, super blocks and malls, for example, all shape the increases in guard labour. In this respect, Indonesia has sort of been a bit ahead of the curve. It's been actually since the 1990s that Indonesia had more private security, that's registered private security, than it had police. And in fact, I tried to crunch the statistics. I haven't put them on a graph for you, but before I did the presentation, and Indonesia has one of the highest ratios of private security per capita in the world. It has a relatively small police force, roughly around 500,000 in total for the country. But as of July 2023, and this is registered security companies, and I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the context of registered security companies. There are around 1.7 million satpam, satuan pengamanan, another term for security guard. So Indonesia has had and continues to have a large guard labour force. And again, and I do this in my paper, explore the links between patterns of guard labour and forms of socioeconomic inequality as they manifest in cities. They have concrete infrastructural implications. So conceptually, I've been engaging with these ideas of guard labour. And when I was talking to security company directors in Jakarta, they explained it in very simple terms. One in particular has mainly corporate clients who have private security. It's very popular now. Firearm possession and training in firearms is actually also very common amongst some of the more well-heeled of Jakarta. And he explained it in simple terms. He says, yeah, the more they have, the less safe they feel. It's great because, of course, they have a vested interest in this. So these perceptions of risk and threat also shape the dimensions of security governance. Now, I wanted to just give a little bit of historical context because I think there are two broad trends that were established during the New Order that have changed but have formed a kind of a logic of sorts that's flowed into the contemporary era. Now, if we look at transformations of Jakarta from the 1970s onwards, we saw this intersecting with the tendencies of the New Order regime, which were paranoid. Nothing scared the New Order more than the idea of the masses. And as Jakarta transformed in two directions, with the emergence of new housing estates, of new manufacturing, new factories, which required forms of security, you also saw the influx of migrants, the spread and growth of informal settlements and kampung. And these kampung to the New Order represented a kind of threat. They were a place where things could happen, where uprising could occur. And so there were patterns put in place, or there was policies put in place to try and manage these things. And one in particular that was put in place in the 1980s is what's called siskamling, the environmental security system. Many people associate it with the guard posts that you'll see in local neighbourhoods, but it represented a broader rethinking of how to manage the security environment. You'd seen emergent private security companies in the 1980s in Jakarta. Many were formed out of the linkages between people who'd spent time in prison. People had strong networks in that kind of way, and that scared the regime. Oh gosh, that was quick. It scared the regime, who was worried about the formation of a structural kind of threat, something akin to the mafia. So they introduced the syscamling system. It established Satpam as a kind of a proto-police force. They weren't the police, but they were also not fully not the police. They had a limited territorial scope linked to the protection of private property. And I call this linking into a kind of defensive security urbanism, which saw the establishment of the Satpam. Then in Kampong, you had a different approach. You had the system of syscamling, which involved local guards, the co-option of local gangsters, of local strongmen, and also self-surveillance into a kind of political policing of neighbourhoods, which the regime saw as places that could be spaces of unrest, spaces of turmoil. And how's the best way to maintain security? Well, you incorporate the sources of insecurity as agents of security. And that's been one of the great sort of contradictions of figures like the preman, which normatively refers to as a gangster or a thug, as figures who are both sources of insecurity but also security at the same time. So post-New Order Jakarta saw a fragmentation of these arrangements. It saw residents actively seeking security on their own terms, forms of vigilantism, forms of social organisations that concern themselves with security, often in religious or moral or cultural terms. There was a contestation of what security meant. Space was contested, and territory, if we understand territory as trying to establish authority within a particular area, was also contested between different groups. And it was quite a violent era. The early 2000s, Jakarta saw frequent conflicts between different groups. It saw struggles over local economies. The politics of parking, for example, saw significant, often violent conflicts between different groups in central Jakarta. An attempt to try...
No rush, I am sorry, that was my mistake. No rush.
You're messing with me. All right, I'll slow down then. I was ploughing through it at high speed. Okay, let me go back to my other slide then. So you saw these new poles emerge about contesting different spatial and moral orders in the city. Forms of identity, forms of community became the basis for articulating logics of security within the city. At the same time, processes of urban transformation continued. Jakarta is, of course, the city of malls. It has more shopping malls. Someone maybe correct me if I'm wrong, has more shopping malls than almost any other city in the world. You saw the expansion of gated estates that were formed around ideas of forms of social homogeneity. Social homogeneity can only be produced through significant security interventions. The screening of people, who can come and go, and how people experience a sense of exclusion from other elements of the city. So what we saw was an attempt to establish a new framework for organising a broad and often kind of cacophony of different security actors in the city. In formal legislative terms, we saw the 2002 police law, which outlined outside of the police a number of non-state security actors who were recognised by the police. These were broadly referred to as PAM Swarkasa, which is a sort of a voluntary security agent of some sort. And there were three different types. There were registered security guards. There was what was referred to as local wisdom or customary groups. the most commonly cited example of which is Pecalang in Bali, who are involved in the security over traditional practices, cultural and religious practices, and then voluntary community groups concerned with security, a suitably ambiguous term that encompasses an entire gambit of paramilitary organisations, militia groups, religious groups such as the Defenders of Islam Front, as well as local organisations that verge from genuine community organisations through to predatory and criminal organisations as well. What it did, importantly, is it established the police as the gatekeepers. So with the separation of the military and the police were now empowered to determine who was and wasn't registered as a security actor. So it saw the emergence of the private security industry. During the New Order, there were very strict controls on private security actors. The police and the military had their own kind of rackets or businesses at hand, but other actors were strictly controlled. This sort of constituted almost a liberalisation of private security. Security companies could register with the police. They had to undergo training from the police, so SATPAM had to be registered with the police and there were 3 different levels of training, and so it led to a form of professionalisation of the security market. And this happened very quickly. Within the space of a couple of years, there were hundreds and then later thousands of registered security companies in Jakarta. And it also saw a huge influx of international players. Security is such a massive commodity in a place like Jakarta. Many international companies, G4S from the Sugiarto group, for example. One of the longest players in Indonesia is Secom. It's one of the largest Japanese private security providers. All saw the opportunities of the Jakarta market and a friendly market to international players. So we also saw interesting kind of mergers where big capital intensive private security companies would move in to Jakarta. They would buy up smaller companies that often struggled with the contract and paying of staff element, and this saw the consolidation of some international players as well. So this market competition, in some cases, had what you could broadly call, in the terms of Norbert Elias, a civilising effect, insofar as the more players that they were, there was a surprising absence of conflict and violence. The early 2000s was a kind of ordering period of different groups contesting authority and territory, but by the mid to late 2010, the industry was relatively well consolidated, and you saw the establishment of niche specialisations, executive bodyguards, intelligence gathering units, for example. There's quite extraordinary resources deployed by some, or services, I should say, offered by some private security companies, particularly to the corporate sector, to infiltrate local societies, to detect possible dissent to building a new factory or a new land development. So these are all commodities that are offered to the marketplace. Companies themselves, and they're still the biggest clients of private security, will often employ a number of different kinds of security providers. That will be, one example is Agung Podomoro. It's one of the biggest land developers in Jakarta, and they have in-house security who are trained via the police SATPAM system, who they employ. But they also contract social organisations, such as a Banten organisation and a militia called the Laskar Merah Putih. And this is really part of how they negotiate the different kinds of security challenges they may face. So ormas, to put it bluntly, will be used in contestation, land, contestation over land, occupying land, intimidating local people. And there's a third arm element to it. Companies are sensitive to public opinion. Where there's blowback, they can distance themselves from it. But they'll also have their own in-house security guards, and often, as you can see on the slide at the top, often have relationships with foreign providers. The top slide, the text, I apologise, isn't particularly clear, is from a local security organisation called SPD. They have a contractual arrangement with a group called Asset, who are a US-based private military contractor, who subcontract them with corporate clients in Jakarta. And this is actually quite a common kind of arrangement, seeing international players come in and form these kinds of relationships. Another element that I've explored in my paper is looking at this idea of guard labour and satpam as precarious labour. Satpams are routinely underpaid. They suffer serious poor conditions, and over the past decade or so, there's been increasing cases of satpams going on strike, for example, at housing estates when they haven't been paid for months at a time. There's been attempts to unionise, and this was an interesting case where there were satpam organisations that announced their intention to form a serikat satpam, a serikat or a labour union for satpam workers, and this drew to the surface again this kind of ambiguous role of private security, where the police in particular strongly objected, arguing, well, satpam are kind of police, so you can't have the police unionising because it fundamentally compromises what they do. You can't have satpam joining protests. They should be protecting the assets of their employers. So this goes back to this kind of ambiguous relationship with satpam as being neither aparat, not formally a part of the security apparatus, but they're not fully workers at the same time, insofar as they've been denied the opportunity to unionise. How am I going for time? Oh, 1 minute now, okay. So, and I'll try and move through this quite quickly, and I look forward to hopefully some questions from you, is looking at these two forms of the city in Jakarta and how it relates to different kinds of trends in security. One is what I referred to as verticality, and this has seen the rise of digital surveillance. Apartment buildings, super blocks, gated estates often have single portal modes of exclusion and entry, and this has seen an emergent market away from traditional forms of guard labour, satpam, guys milling around, that kind of security, to the increasing use of high-tech security. Increasingly, and this is where international players have cornered the market, you see international security companies introducing facial recognition and AI alongside CCTV and other forms of technological security into integrated systems approaches to security. So this integrated systems, in brief, because I have a minute to go, is a kind of a corporate idea of risk. So security entails not just managing risks of crime and who comes and goes from buildings, but also offering management and surveillance of staff. So SECOM offer AI detection systems which can look for people lurking around the building, but also monitor when workers come and go, when they're at their workstations, and more integrated approaches. And this has been a kind of a great place for foreign players because it's been highly unregulated. And so there's been a great investment in this. Again, I'm conscious of the time, so I'll move along to my next. Is the other world is what I call the horizontal security, and this is in the mixed neighbourhoods and kampung of Jakarta. Time? We're getting to time? Yeah, okay, I'll wrap it up really quickly. And this is a different world entirely, where security actors are intertwined with social relations of the neighbourhood in very complex ways, not just about screening, but preman, and I think preman often get characterised simply as gangsters, but are often involved in very complex sets of relationships and as mediators between urban neighbourhoods with other forms of authority and other kinds of interest. And social organisations, I have an example of the FBR there, the Forum Betawi Rempuk, are a great example of agents of both security and insecurity. They've been predatory, but they've also been highly, often in some cases, very representative of local communities. Okay, and then some conclusions to wrap up. And I make some, I guess, speculative conclusions in my paper about some of the trends that we've seen over the past decade in Jakarta. One, I think the expansion of smart city and security surveillance technology is really a kind of a new frontier in Jakarta's security governance. We already have the integration of AI and facial recognition technology in some public transportation hubs, and the private sector has really had an unregulated freedom in exploring this. This has had some other implications, such as challenging guard labour's historical role of absorbing so-called excess labour, which has had a political function in the Indonesian context, and also the forms of greater spatial segregation, segregation of upper middle classes, in gated estates, etc., and how the securitisation of these spaces is feeding into what I argue is forms of anti-democracy, where hyper-securitised spaces, which regulates social homogeneity, who can come and go, and basically creates spaces where nothing happens, also creates an ambivalence towards democracy itself. It's something that's been documented in other parts of the world. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the fabulous presentation, Ian. And I'm really sorry, I rushed you before. Right. I'm now pleased to welcome our last speaker for this session, Associate Professor Rita Padawangi. Rita Padawangi is an Associate Professor at the College of Interdisciplinary Experiential Learning, Singapore University of Social Sciences. Her work focuses on social movements and participatory urban development, employing collaborative approaches in research, teaching, and also community engagement. Rita also coordinates the Southeast Asia Neighborhoods Network, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, which promotes urban research and education. Her most recent publication is Urban Development in Southeast Asia. Please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Rita Padawangi.
I was told that the organizers are very strict with time, so I also want to keep myself at time here. I know I have a lot of slides, but these are going to be very, very colorful. So, all right, so my task here is to follow up Corry's and Ian's fabulous presentations by talking about public space. Now, public spaces in the city from the civil society perspectives. Now, I want to start with this question. When you hear the term public space, what kind of image come to mind? Like, would it be these kinds of spaces? I know what it is. Okay, this is somewhere in Jakarta. I'll come back to this. You'll see this again later. Or something like this, another colorful photo. And everybody will say, like, I know what it is. All right, so public space can be a place where there are crowds to conduct activities together, or a combination of different groups conducting different activities, but somehow they can share the space. Now, public space remains an important topic that continues to generate critical discussions in any literature about urban planning, urban life, and governance. Readings about cities have identified them as places where strangers can meet, discuss and shape ideas, conduct social activities and actions, all of which require public spaces that are accessible to relatively all citizens. The idea that public spaces are a must-have in any city signifies its importance in city life. Public spaces are an integral part of urban life, be it in the form of the built environment, which is the physical spaces, as well as the social spaces in which these discussions can take place. Without public spaces, a city wouldn't be a city. Public spaces are important ingredients that make cities more than an agglomeration of inhabitants and dwellings. Now, public space and the city, right? So what can they be? So literature say that public spaces can be anything from streets, parks, pavements, beaches, and city squares, until the digital spaces of the media, internet, and social media. So basically a lot of spaces. So in those kinds of spaces, we can see that public spaces usually entails, one is the built environment, or the physicality of the space, the infrastructures, or the social space. Now, when it comes to the physical space, what would or should a public space look like? Now we come to the difficult question, which is about the public. What is actually the public here? In understanding public space is imperative to understand what public is. So public in public spaces entails the concern about the dimensions as well as the extent of its publicness. And the important questions that come up usually: who actually owns public spaces, and how should a public space be governed? And oftentimes, it is sort of like being compared to private spaces. And I'm going to ask the same questions again at the end, right? So public versus private. And we come to the question of accessibility. So public access versus private access. We talked about gates before. We talked about security before. So it encompasses all these aspects. So again, when we ask the same question, who owns a public space? Can a private owner have a public space, which comes to the concept of the privately owned public spaces? This can take place in, I don't know, certain kinds of shopping malls, probably. But then who regulates those public spaces? And then does ownership matter? So all these types of public spaces, can they also be privately owned? So ownership of space will determine accessibility as well as regulations over space. That is the governance of the space. So if we ask the same question again, who is the public? When we say public space, it's very easy to say public space, but who is the public? Is the public equal to government? Because when we say the public sector, oftentimes easily we associate it with government. But is it really that the public space, public means government? So if it has something to do with government, then there is a question of representation. Who represents the public? And we ask the same question again. How should a public space be governed then? All right. So let's go to Indonesia. So how about governing public spaces in cities of Indonesia? We often hear again and again that Indonesia has had the experiment of decentralization, and we see the rise of the local leaders to the national stage. So I have a quote here from the current president. He mentioned, without infrastructure, this country can never be competitive. Right? So he himself rose from being a mayor of Solo and then the governor of Jakarta, and his campaigns has always been associated with his ability to manage cities. So there is this emphasis on urban managerial leadership, which focuses on architecturally beautiful and neat landscapes. Some of you might have recognized this space here. This is the Taman Waduk Pluit, one of the projects that became the poster child of his campaign of his first presidency in 2014. And so urban managerial leadership also relates with infrastructure development. So there is this kind of focus on the managerial qualities in electing a government leader, and architecture and infrastructure becomes a political capital. But then, in the managerial city then, the relationship between state actors and civil society can be somewhat mirrors what Corry has presented before, the relationship between corporate producers and consumers of space. So we often see the celebrated mayors, such as Bu Risma, will have this poster park. This is Taman Bungkul in Surabaya. Or maybe some of you will recognize this park over here. Can any of you recognize here? Ridwan Kamil in Bandung, and this is Taman Film, right? So public space improvements become political capital for many city leaders to get recognized. And I see Mayor Bima actually nodded there. So then, if that is the case, what are the measures of a good public space then that reflects this managerial quality? So there can be projects with image of city improvement, and public spaces are very visible, very exposed. But then we also encounter a challenge here. Some say, and many people say, that Indonesia is a very diverse community. And if we have diverse communities in the city, and we have fragmented societies, like Ian was mentioning, what then? And I ask the same question again. What are the measures of a good public space then in this diverse community? Okay, from those serious questions, let's look at more colorful images that I'm going to show you from different spaces in Indonesia. The reason why I chose these spaces is very out of convenience. I happen to have some research projects in some of these areas, but later on you'll see, and I try to describe them very briefly because we only have 20 minutes total, and I have 4 sites to tell a story about. So let's go back to this place again. And this place is from Jakarta, and talking about public spaces with good physical image, right? This one may be more sort of like fitting to that description. So it may be more generally appealing in spaces that are designed by professional architects, such as this park here, which is the Tebet Eco Park in Jakarta, that has been very popular since its development or redevelopment. So this has just reopened in 2022. But then if we see public spaces, it can also be spaces like these. So when spaces are less quote-unquote polished by professional architects, suddenly it becomes a gray area, but it doesn't really negate that it is still a public space. So in the same city, there can be public spaces like these too. This particular public space, situated under the highway in North Jakarta, is collectively managed by a community. We can see that the space is accessible, but those who are not involved in managing it may not feel encouraged to access. So this is probably my densest slide out of all. So in terms of governing public spaces, we come to the question of inclusion and exclusion. Public spaces as shared spaces that are accessible to everyone in the community is presumably for collective goods. But Indonesia's social, political, and economic situation are rife with inequalities. So we ask the question here then, public space by whom and for whom? So publicness in public spaces would be more complex when there are different communities with different interests using the same space. The collision of interests occur when they are using the same limited space. The larger, the denser a city, the more likely collisions will take place. So here we have an example of the collision between pedestrian and street vendors. This is from 2019. The Supreme Court ruled against a bylaw in Jakarta on street vending. The plaintiffs were individuals from the Indonesian Solidarity Party, known as the PSI, that argued, A, street vendors are disturbances to the people's right to the sidewalk, especially the pedestrians, and B, street vendors profit commercially from their operations on the public spaces at the expense of the pedestrians and other people's access. This Supreme Court ruling begs the question, then, of who the public is in the case of sidewalks in Jakarta, and more generally, what public space is. More generally, again, the ban on certain uses of public spaces raises the question of who has the authority to decide and what is the basis of that decision. So, when the city is fragmented along social inequalities and identities, will the perceived collective good of one community also be a collective good of another? Or will it condemn other communities to being excluded from public space? And then we ask the same question again. Which society are we talking about here? Public space by whom and for whom? So another example of colliding interests in public spaces in Jakarta is the case of riverbank spaces, with public good or collective good being put forth as the basis of concrete embankment project against flooding along the Ciliwung. 2 kampungs, Kampung Pulo was evicted in August 2015, and Bukit Duri across the river were flattened in September 2016. And this photo was taken 5 days after Bukit Duri was flattened. So passing by that place now will seem like a public space, but underneath the space was the story of forced evictions of hundreds of households and local communities. So in terms of governing public spaces, with the example of flood alleviation projects in Jakarta, who actually decides on Jalan Inspeksi as the project for flood alleviation? Who decides on the approaches of concrete embankment? And who gets affected from these decisions? Who benefits and who gets sacrificed? Will these public spaces actually sacrifice people and children like Bintang, who said Bintang's house is gone, demolished, dibeko, and beko is actually the word from backhoe, which is related to development. But in Jakarta, beko means eviction. So, and then we come back to the increasing demand for a managerial city leadership. The beautification projects that is associated with public spaces might actually be marginalizing adversely affected groups through residential and or economic displacements. So we come back again to this photo here, which I'm sure many of you would recognize that this is from Taman Kalijodo, which also include forced eviction of the Kalijodo community. So beautiful public spaces according to whom? And I'm just quoting a paper here from Saigon that beautification has often been associated as an element of control. And beautiful public spaces, according to who, overlooks diversity of needs and aspirations. If we have a city as diverse as Jakarta, this is a map from Pak Abidin's chapter in this maps the kampungs in Jakarta, as well as a map of the Gini ratio in the metropolitan area of Jakarta by Pak Deden Rukmana. So the next story will come from another city in Surabaya. So after those critical questions, right? So when we say we make collective decisions on governing public spaces, how can it be look like, right? So here we go to the city of Surabaya, but I'm not gonna tell a story about Bu Risma, okay? Whether or not Bu Risma was the mayor, this public space will still be around. So, we are going to Kampung Penele in Surabaya. So these are the examples of governing public spaces in city neighborhoods. So the example here, I show you that they have the rule to ban motorized vehicles in the alleyways, much like compared to the banning of street vendors on the sidewalks, right? But the difference here, the banning of the motorized vehicles was a decision taken among the residents. Motorcycles have to turn off their engines and push the vehicle as they enter the kampung all the way into their own homes, and this applies to delivery riders as well. Such rule is for the purpose of noise reduction, which was perceived as a collective good in the kampung, as the alleyways were narrow and noises from motor vehicles would have been very close to their doors and windows. The alleyways can also change uses according to the festive seasons. Besides festivities such as weddings and Independence Day celebrations, the alleyways of Kampung Penele completely transformed during the days building up to Idul Adha, being filled with sheep and cows as kurban animals. The alleyways are also spaces for children to play, from hide and seek to alleyway football. So Surabaya is more than just Bu Risma. Okay. And there are also public spaces like this. This is also from Surabaya. All right. This is from Kampung Srengkali in Surabaya. The one on the left and the one on the right side. We're going back to Jakarta. So if Surabaya can do that, can Jakarta do that too? Yes. The image on the right in Surabaya and in Jakarta was from Jakarta's Kampung Hijau Berseri in Cempaka Putih, in which the residents themselves collectively developed the space as a green alleyways. You should visit if you have a chance. All right. So from Jakarta, let's go to one of the fake kabupatens in Pak Arman's presentation. This is from the fake Kabupaten Gianyar in Ubud. The collective governance of space can also be observed here. This is one of the community halls in one of the banjars in Ubud. And during my observation of community activities in an urbanizing village in Ubud, the community hall was an example of a public space that was open to the residents with a condition that those who come to the space was to wear traditional Balinese outfit. So these public spaces can be used together, collectively, and they can put regulations also be made collectively. And then, this is the furthest case study from the three. A separate observation of neighborhood-scale public spaces was in Kampung Yoboy in urbanizing Sentani in Papua. It provided me an opportunity to experience their colorful walkway, which involved the residents in painting the wooden planks to improve the space appearance. The kampung also has a publicly accessible community library, a rumah baca, or reading house, as a node of communal activities. All these spaces are governed on the neighborhood level and are relatively autonomous from the top-down intervention from a higher level of government. But collective governance of space, does it really just apply to these other cities, not just Jakarta? Well, we saw the example from Cempaka Putih. This is another example that we saw in Elisa's presentation yesterday. And I couldn't resist, you know. I went, okay, I present after Ian, I have a photo of him in Kampung Susun. So here you go. This is Kampung Susun Aquarium. So the city need not be small to feature collective governance. It can be a big city with some autonomy of neighborhoods, and also this can be seen in the Kampung Bukit Duri in Jakarta during their Pasar Rakyat, in which they convert the space into this festival. So upon exploring the possibilities of collective governance, how democratic can public space governance be? When there's a range of diversity, inequality towards segregation and eventually fragmentation, how can colliding publics govern public spaces democratically? Those that are accessible to all, when the city is a collection of segregated communities, when political power and economic inequality obstruct equal voices in governing public spaces, and when collective good of one community can collide with another's. And speaking of collision, it can even get greater when we see democratic public spaces that necessitates the diverse uses as diverse as this, including challenging those in power. And this is a photo from Reformasi di Korupsi. So in governing public spaces in the city, the manifestation of democracy in public spaces are actually the result of reformasi. Before reformasi, public protests may bring trouble to the protesters, like what was experienced by Suara Ibu Peduli in this photo. So community and civil society associations really need autonomous spaces to effectively gather, debate, vote on, and to participate in issues concerning the local and broader urban community. So again, going back to the question, how should a public space be governed? And I'm just gonna highlight the last one here. How does public space beautification regime fit with democratic governance? And if we see spaces like this, after Suharto's resignation, protests actually took place in Jakarta almost every day. And protests may bring messiness and contradiction with the beautification regime. And the public spaces as common resources can be places for marginalized communities to capitalize on the public space's visibility and exposure. And this includes the urban poor, victims and survivors of human rights violation, and concerns from the countryside. And I'm just gonna flip through here, okay? If there is a concern from the evictions in Pulau Rempang, for example, where would they go to bring their concerns? They bring their concerns not just in Pulau Rempang, but they bring their concerns to BP Batam, which is on another island, and they can bring also, in this case, their concern to Jakarta. This is a concern from the Kendeng Mountain farmers that bring their concerns to the presidential palace in Jakarta. All right, so let's learn from smaller scale public spaces in Jakarta, in Indonesia as common resources. And I'm just gonna quote here, sorry, I ran out of time, but let me just read through this, because I think this is one of the main points, is that this new mode of governance that we learn from public spaces is not an instantly produced societal structure, but rather is an evolving process that allows for trial and error. However, adequate support from the government can ensure continued provision of public goods and enhance commitments to social equity and environmental sustainability. Thank you very much.
I noticed Rita also turned on her timer, which is good. So you have your own time management. That is good. Okay, now what remarkable presentations! Thank you so much, all panelists. I'm sure many of you have lots of questions. Now let's take 4 questions. Okay, Ross, and then from that side, Nava. And in the middle, and and then Sana. Let's start from Russ. Okay. Oh, sorry, Pak Hal.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry,
hi.
sorry, Pak Hal. Yeah, I think
I
it's
think
almost
I've just-
lunchtime, Pak.
Terima kasih. I've just had a name change. I'm Hal Hill.
Yeah, next to Pak Ross. Sorry.
Thank you. So I got a question or comment which is applying to several sessions, but it's illustrated with this session, I think, as well. And that is how Indonesia can learn from successes elsewhere in the neighbourhood. And I think a good illustration of that, Corry, if I could direct it to you, one of the best examples in the world of public housing, of Perumahan Rakyat, is next door in Singapore. The Housing Development Board, I think, still has 80% of Singapore's population. And, you can say lots of things about Singapore, but that's clearly, I think, a success story widely acknowledged. Question is, why can't Indonesia, or should Indonesia learn from it, and if so, how? And just in case it's thought that it's because Singapore's rich and all that, it's different, when the HDB, the Housing Development Board, started in Singapore, Singapore's per capita income was probably about the same as Indonesia's now. So, and by the way, the same question applies to every other session, I think, and a good example was public transport yesterday. Congestion pricing is an obvious solution to combine with, really efficient mass public transport, and that's illustrated in Singapore, by the way, and elsewhere in the region. So the question is, I guess, in all sessions, learning from successes elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Nava?
Thank you. My question is for Ian. So with the rise of all these private security companies, often foreign ones, and the digital surveillance, how does that affect the relationship with traditional ormas like Pemuda Pancasila and Laskar Merah Putih? So are you seeing an emergent pattern of relationship? Do the Pemuda Pancasila stick to the competitive advantage, as political canvasser, for example? How do you see it? Thanks.
Okay, Bu Afi, in the middle.
Terima kasih. Saya Afi dari Ciliwung. It's a short question. It's about the status of the owner and how the ownerships of the land. Like most of the presentations, I see it's a foreign face, like myself in Jakarta. So what happened to them, and whether there is a good example of the owners of the land that reclaim the landscape of the new urban. Thank you.
Anna?
My question is Thanks. So my question is for Ian and for Corry. Both of you are describing a scenario in which a particular class of residents are increasingly opting out of being recipients of public service. Security, so they're securing themselves by employing private guards and they're building themselves facilities. What do you think that trend will do to impact the delivery of public service to the rest of the population? Do you think it'll make elected officials more likely to provide services and orient themselves to providing services for the poor who are not eligible for these kinds of private arrangements? Or do you think it will just make them less likely to deliver overall? Thanks.
Great. Who will start? Mbak Corry.
Okay, thank you for the question. First, for Pak Hol, why Indonesia cannot learn from the successful stories of other places? That's a big question. They learn a lot. They do, comparative study and everything, but the government somehow always have reasons and excuses why. In terms of Singapore and HDB, they always say that Singapore has a very advantageous in land ownership, while in Jakarta the land is scarce, so it's so hard to build and it's so hard to implement the same system as HDB. That's the main reasons. And then they also, because of especially for middle class, the government tend to give it away to the private and to the market. Okay. Can I answer all?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure if I get it right about the ownership of the land in housing complexes. Most of them owned by the individuals. So if you buy a unit of house, you get your unit, but the developers still manage outside your home. So for example, the roads, the street lamps, the trees and everything. And usually they also take care of, monopolize the water and then also the electricity. As I told you before, the local government sell it in bulks to the developers, and then they disperse it to the houses. And for Sana, in South Tangerang, unfortunately, actually, we discussed this a lot. Actually, the developers already take big chunks of, managing the city, right? So it's easier. Supposed to be easier for the local government, but so far there's not much evidence going on, and we're still asking why. Actually, I'm sorry for that.
Okay, Pak Ian, yeah.
Thanks. Nava, just to your question, it really depends on the context. One thing that private security company directors told me a lot was the biggest problem they face in the field was dealing with ormas. And that was summarised by two conflicting logics. One was that private security companies are delivering a service to a client, and ormas are based in ideas of territorial entitlement. That's how it was explained to me, and I think it captures that very well. So in some cases, security companies will be hired by, a factory, for example, and will have conflict with ormas that feel that that's their turf. And so they feel entitled to getting something, but without necessarily offering something. So there is tension points. Pemuda Pancasila is probably the good example because they're deeply entrepreneurial. And so you'll find in Pemuda Pancasila that they will, if there's an opportunity to do something, they'll do it. So they have security companies linked to them, and highly professional ones. In fact, some of the most highly trained security providers, particularly for executive security, are from people within Pemuda Pancasila, including people who've trained in Israel, the United States, in skills that they sell to executive clients. Other groups might struggle with that, but there is, in the field, there is a tension between those traditional groups and then private security. Sana, so on your question, there's probably a couple of ways of looking at it. I think in some respects, that sort of securitization of space and that retreat from the public intersects with a kind of political passivity. So I wonder whether it has political impacts insofar as these communities or spaces already feel served, where if you don't have the services, and we've seen great examples with Kampung Aquarium and other, people are politically active, and so they will engage in the political process to try and deliver things. So I guess maybe that might be the kind of logic that's at play, or dynamic. Thanks.
Let me just very quickly to respond on why Indonesia cannot replicate from the neighbors. Having lived in Singapore for quite some time, I also often get these questions. But I would also answer, going back to Pak Abidin's presentation yesterday about the critical juncture. I think we already passed it a long time ago. Maybe it started around the same kind of economic conditions when the countries first got independence. But then besides the question of scale of land, that was already Corry explained before, Indonesia also has a vast diversity and also unequal geographies. So we are not just looking at Jakarta, but if we go to islands that are further away from Java, we can see that the gradation, the spectrum is actually very wide. So it's very difficult to have like one size fits all program in terms of housing for the whole of Indonesia. Indonesia tried to have it, and I would say that it doesn't really get very far. And furthermore, in Singapore, we also need to remember now, yes, it does, the HDB, the Housing and Development Board in Singapore does house 85% of Singaporeans and residents, which means that the HDB is the largest developer of the country. So the largest developer. Now, if we ask the same question to Indonesia, is Perumnas the largest developer in Indonesia? And I think many of us will smile. And I guess this also signifies a difference in terms of the political economy of housing in Indonesia.
Okay, great. So I would like to remind you again, please ask a short and concise question, preferably one person, one question. And I would like to ask Haura, we have also questions from our Zoom audience. Haura?
Yeah. Okay, so we have, is it alright to have two questions?
Two questions.
So the first question is from Tonia Sinaga, IPB University, Bogor. I have always thought that steel barricades across shops, windows, doors, and cars in Manila, Philippines are due to high level of this informal security apparatus. It's directed to Ian. Based on your presentations now, she thinks that perhaps it's because they do not have as much as these security groups in Jakarta. Therefore, they maintain their own security. Yet both the regimes in Manila and Jakarta embrace anti-democratic cultures before. What makes Jakarta different to Manila? And second question from Arya Duta from Yogyakarta to Mbak Corry. How do Tangselians struggle to participate politically? Nice. And how do they participate? Is it through the consumerisms in coffee shops or malls? That's the questions. Thank you.
Okay, and we can take two more questions. Okay, one in the middle, and then one there. And yeah, we might open another Q&A session after this. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, in the middle.
Hi, I'm Clara from ANU. My question is directed to Mbak Rita. What does it take to prevent that the middle class sort of capture the kind of public issues shared across classes and groups? Like we know, like flood mitigations, and then the solution is evictions and relocations. Although flooding is sort of like an issue for everyone, right? Yesterday we see Lisa presentation in Kampung, and it takes a lot of effort for 1, 2, 3 kampungs, right? But there are hundreds of kampung, there are millions of Jakartans and urban cities in Indonesia. What does it take to create a sense of political conscience across classes and groups? Thank you.
Yeah. And one more? Yeah.
Test. Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Andy. I'm representative of Australia Awards G20 Awards, G20 Scholars, sorry. I would like to direct my question to Ibu Rita Padawangi as well. I find the presentation is pretty much interesting for me as well. So I have a two-prong of question, which I think are quite relevant with each other. So the first one is like you mentioned about the public society ownership could affect how the collective good could be represented or even amplified. So in your research, I would like to understand how the ownership of the public or even the privately owned public space affect the collective good. And the second prong is like, you're mentioning as well about the beautification of public park, which identified element of control with that public spaces. In that sense, I would like to understand how does this affect collective good for society in general. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So should we start with Rita?
I just finished jotting down the questions.
Oh, okay.
But, okay, it's all right. So I guess I'll answer the first one first. How do we cultivate cross-class political conscience across group? I guess there are different possibilities, and I guess when a good example of this is when Reformasi happened, right? How did it happen? And there was like one particular crisis that actually drove them all, and suddenly everybody got into a lower economic class because of the economic crisis, and that opens up a window. But that only happened when there was already a building of movements that from below. Reformasi did not just happen because of the crisis, but for years of mobilization that suddenly find some political opportunity that comes out. So one thing that I would say about the cross-caste political consciousness in sort of like cultivating the sense of political publicness in the city, it is always a long and messy process, like what I quoted at the end. That was from the Public Intellectual Forum that we had in 2020. Some of us here was also in that forum. I'm looking at you, Pak Abidin. We were in that forum as well. One thing that for sure, Indonesia has gone through years of experience of not actually asking about these questions. We have 32 years of the New Order era in which we are kind of separate. We are segregated from the different groups' concerns. At that time we didn't even know what was going on in the other parts of Indonesia, for example. So it is always a work in progress, and there's no quick solution to this, given that the situation has built up for decades. I would say, though, that the current regime of beautification doesn't really help in that, because that also kind of obscures the different kinds and the diversity of the voices of different kinds of spaces that are needed in our diverse society. So it's not just in terms of education, I would say, but also in terms of just continuing the kinds of discussions that are going on, utilizing the existing and still working public spaces that embraces all, including the public space that might happen not in physical spaces. Like last night, for example, there was a public space that happened on Twitter, now X, talking about how the media would react to the eviction of Pulau Rempang, for example. And that's the kinds of discussions that needs to continue to cultivate until a kind of political opportunity also appears again.
Okay, thank you, Rita. So, Pak Ian, you want to add something? Yeah. No? No? Okay, then Mbak Corry? Yeah.
Okay, if I'm not mistaken, it's about how do Tangselian participate politically, right? Yeah, of course, in cafes. There are two types of Tangselians, actually. The one who do not care about politics at all, so they're already busy with their lives and the school of the kids and everything. And the other one is SJW. There are a lot of social justice warriors who live in South Tangerang. Yeah. They talk a lot about the situation in the city, but it goes nowhere, unfortunately, so far. So we hope someday. But some other groups actually try to make public initiatives, but usually for, like, for example, making the neighborhood more green, more that kind of initiative instead of politically.
Okay, so, right, we still have one quick, okay. 1 minute left. 1 minute left. I thought one more question. Okay, right. Okay, I'm just, we are conscious of the time. So I'm sure that, we are happy to continue. So we'll continue at the next update. So please stay in your seats as we are now ready to hear the closing address. And before that one, please join me in thanking all these wonderful panelists. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks so much. So now for the closing address, I would like to hand over to Professor at Aspinall and also Dr. Amalinda Savirani, who will introduce our speaker. Amalinda Savirani. Oh, Savirani. Apologies. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you everyone for staying for our final session. And it gives me great pleasure today to welcome a special guest to give our closing address. It's long been a tradition in the Indonesia Update that we invite, as well as academics, journalists and other forms of commentators, people who are directly involved in, as practitioners in the topic that we are discussing for the Indonesia Update. So it makes a lot of sense that with our topic being governing urban Indonesia, that we end with someone who's actually been doing just that, i.e. governing a very big and important part of urban Indonesia. So our guest today is Bima Arya Sugiarto, who has been mayor of Bogor, as I'm sure everyone here knows. Not Tangsel, yeah. So there's been a bit of a competition between Surabaya, Tangsel, Bogor, Bandung. But Pak Bima has been the mayor of Bogor since 2014, so coming to the close of his term very soon. Before that, he had a very successful career in academia, running a polling institute, amongst other things. As it happens, he also has a PhD from this university. In fact, I can see his former supervisor sitting right there in the middle, Pak Greg Feely. So for Pak Bima, this is a sort of back to campus moment and a back to Canberra moment. And I should also welcome back to Canberra Ibu Yane Ardian Rahman as well. You're also very welcome. It's great to see you back here. But there's one more element of Pak Bima's CV which makes him very appropriate as our closing speaker, namely that as well as being the mayor of Bogor, he's also the chair of APEXI, so the Asosiasi Pemerintah Kota Seluruh Indonesia, so the All Indonesia Association of City Governments, the organization of city mayors. So arguably you could say he is the best placed person to give us a practitioner's view, a view from the inside of governing urban Indonesia. So thank you very much, Pak Bima.
Thank you very much, Pak Ed, Ibu Linda. Thanks for inviting me to the update, and I really enjoy the perspective on urban issues which were circulated yesterday and today, and allow me to enrich those perspectives by adding insight from my experience, or if I may say, an honest review from the field. And frankly to say, it is not easy for me to summarize my 10 years experience as a mayor, especially in responding to what Mustafa said yesterday, that what is happening in Bogor is only midway reform. Been there, done that, ups and downs, and he said only midway reform. So I think I will be your first and strongest supporter if you are nominating yourself as the mayor of Tangsel. To lead all the Tangselians. So I will explore the dynamics of city leadership, the challenges it faces, and also the leadership model chosen in addressing those challenges. And as Ed said, this perspective can also be seen as the experience shared by mayors across of Indonesia, because I have a lot of opportunities, not only observing, but also in channeling the mayor aspirations at the national level. Let me begin with the issue of election campaign. I would like to highlight the importance of election campaign. It does not only determine who will win the election, but also how the elected mayor can effectively run the government. More specifically, the campaign fund factor, dana kampanye. Yes, politics is expensive. And yes, everything needs money. But I am convinced that how we deal the money and how we found our campaign determine our performance. Yes, it is hard to win the election. Yes, it is very difficult to win the election with a very low cost of budget. But learning and observing from any local election in Indonesia, I believe that leading the city will be harder and much more complicated when we are trapped by the interests of donors and sponsors who funded our campaign. So the first and early fight is actually a fight to remain independent at any cost. I remember rejecting donations and contribution for a number of business persons, including one big tobacco industries who want to help our campaign at that time. Because Bogor is known as one of the frontliner city who has a very strong firm in dealing with tobacco control, Kota Anti Rokok. Thank you. And until the end of campaign session, back in 2014, no more than 10 billion rupiahs was spent, and this amount was among the lowest compared to other candidates at the time. My primary source of funding coming from families, friends, seniors, and other donors who contributed without any first-step interest, in my opinion. And I narrowly won by margin only 1,755, or 0.25%, slightly margin, after going through a very tough election filled with a negative campaign. And I thought that was the hardest one. I thought that was the toughest one, but I was wrong. Like all elected mayors in Indonesia, the post-election politics challenged me more. Once elected, it was clear to me that while change is easily spoken, it is indeed difficult to put it into action. Leading a city, for me, not just about having ideas or even courage. And I realized at the time, the golden moment being a political analyst and political commentator has gone. No more media darling. Everything that I do, everything that I say could possibly be wrong. And when I was inaugurated, I was like a king with any power to execute my vision. But in fact, I found that mayor is not the only actor. Mayor is not the only king. There are many more powerful actors, like senior bureaucrats, senior party leaders, big entrepreneurs who has their own interests, and also mass media and even contractors who are exercising their strong influence among the bureaucracy. And these actors are actually bound by one common interest in securing their interests under a very collusive system. And I found that it is not easy to make our local budget truly benefit our people. I discovered that a handful of players tend to monopolize the projects. These key players are often end up as the winners in the procurement system funded by city budget. And something that I could never imagine before is the illegal intervention of certain law enforcers in the city projects. You see, sometimes these officials ask for a share of government project funds. And if the request isn't granted, they begin to criminalizing bureaucracy by involving local NGOs and also the media. And some local NGO or LSM are actually part of the problems. Not NGOs like Asia Foundation, of course. No. They play a political maneuver as pressure group in collaborating with law enforcers and mass media for economic purpose. And looking inside the city hall in Balai Kota, it was even more challenging to see the character of the bureaucrats, dominated by senior bureaucrats whose careers were built upon the old trajectory created by my predecessors. I was the first non-bureaucrats to be elected as a mayor, and I am the first Bogorian to be elected as a mayor. And I'm also the youngest mayor ever in Bogor history. Can you imagine the complication of my status at that time? And I also faced a top-down development planning system with almost no public participation. It was very sad to know that the actual government department's activities don't seem to align with the mayor visions. So mayors may come and go, but the department's plans often still the same. It's like copy-pasting from the previous plan, year to year. And our city budget can be quite inefficient. A significant amount of money can be allocated to things they may not bring substantial impact or output. For example, planting 50 trees can cost 10 million rupiahs for expenses like producing t-shirts, setting up tents, providing meals, snacks, and so on and so forth. So biaya makan minum is so expensive. And Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, in the middle of these situations, it is important to note that the middle class in Bogor is growing in numbers, with many of them commuting to work in Jakarta on a daily basis, but they tend to be very skeptical with the local issues and unconsolidated. They basically don't care about what is happening in the city of Bogor. On the other hand, another NGOs, like I mentioned before, are very active in collaborating with dirty players. Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit that in the middle of 2014, the first few months after I elected, I felt like a lonely guy in town who has impossible mission. Of course, giving up is not the option. In facing of these challenging situations, it is clear that we need a very effective strategy. And I do believe that the most significant step is to break the vicious circle, lingkaran setan, and the chain of corrupt practices. And it is crucial to declare and to prove that the mayor will never enrich themselves and never accept any gift from anyone, from any parties, that could compromise our integrity and decision-making independence. And I have known some of my colleagues, inspiring mayors, who show a high level of integrity. Some of them like Ibu Risma, Pak Azwar Anas, and Pak Ridwan Kamil in Bandung, for example. And I urge all the government officials to stay focused on their works and not trouble themselves in pleasing and serving the mayor. So breaking the vicious circle, I believe it should be started by the example from the top position. And in facing all of these challenges, I only have two options: deliver or fail. And reforming our bureaucracy is a top priority. I made the process of creating our city development plan, our APBD, more open by involving think tanks, universities, creative communities, and so on and so forth. And I made the city budget document accessible to the public. We announced a number of channels for the public to voice their concerns and aspirations. And in 2019, we opened the public service mall. I learned from Banyuwangi, from Pak Azwaranas, which has now become one of the best in Indonesia. It is one of the model for Indonesian other cities. And we want to provide the best service to our citizens, not only to make the service easier, but also to make people happier. For example, the citizen can do the marriage contract at our public service mall, akad nikah, and if they are lucky, the mayor will be the witness. Make them happier. And also the high standard of the achievement for all bureaucrats in the city of Bogor, and I increased their allowance, which are now among one of the highest in Indonesia. And talking about public spaces, as far as the public interest is concerned, I realize that I have to prove that the government is strongly committed to making the city belong to public. I believe that sense of belonging to the city is really important for bounding the citizen with their leaders and their city. So we improve the quality of public spaces, such as city parks, pedestrian paths, government buildings, and also slum areas. The areas which were initially occupied by local thug, preman-preman lokal, oknum RT, RW, were revitalized and normalized, so the people can use it freely, and it's normal now. And yeah, okay. And in the very, and after 15 years, and hundreds of meetings with many parties, the Yasmin Church case was resolved. For some parties, I see that it is not the ideal solution because the church has to move around 1 kilometer from the original site. But I believe it is the best possible options. The case should be closed and we have to move on. So for me, it was not fulfilling my campaign promises, but it was like returning the image of Bogor as the city for all. And in a very uncertain political situations, linked with strong pragmatism and transactional culture, the alternative options is building a support from the community. And since 2010, I have witnessed how a new breed of local leaders started bringing together the strength of community, academia, think tank, entrepreneurs, creative communities, youngster, Gen Z, Gen X, millennial, and so on and so forth. And in our city, in the city of Bogor, one good example is Bogor Sahabat, the Friends of Bogor, which has become one of my circle esteem in guiding government policies. These communities cares about issues like nationalism, diversity, and the environment. They provide a very strong support for any city government policy related to these issues. And Bapak Ibu, besides consolidating communities and the middle class, staying close to the grassroots level is also important. I have implemented a mayor's tent program, Tenda Wali Kota, where I stay overnight among the residents in listening to their voice and their critics, and setting up my office in neighborhood or ngantor di kelurahan to check on the performance of our staff. And over 10 years, almost every weekend, I've been doing something that I never imagined before as part of mayor's duty. That is the witness or the wedding of the citizen. Every weekend during my administration, almost 10 years. And apart from the support from the grassroots and the middle class, it is very vital to establish connections with national political leaders. In many cases, mayors face obstacles in implementing the programs or encounter legal issues when they don't have good relations with party elites or political elites in Jakarta. So building relations with governors, with ministers, with party leaders, and even with the president is important. Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, I realize that in many situations, being realistic is crucial. Sometimes our ideal plans cannot be achieved or may not be worked out. So in those cases, we should be willing to compromise and negotiate to come up with plan B, plan C, and plan D when our first choice or ideal scenario is not feasible. So this applies not just for cases like Yasmin Church cases, but also another sensitive issues like dealing with PKL, reforming the bureaucracy, and also working with the council members. In many cases, I was criticized for failing public expectations, but my argument is always like that. This decision should be made, case closed, and we have to move on. The best among the worst and the most possible option should be chosen among any available options. Bapak Ibu, the direct election system has actually paved the way for the emergence of local champions. Local autonomy create local champions. I am inspired and learn from many inspiring local leaders like Ibu Risma, Pak Jokowi, and Kang Ridwan Kamil. There is a book called If Mayors Rule the World by Benjamin Barber. It is like the Bible for mayors. And I was given one copy by senior economist Bang Faisal Basri before I took office as a mayor in 2014. So according to Barber, city leadership holds power and authority beyond the boundaries of the city or even beyond the boundaries of nation state. But this kind of influence is weakening in Indonesia today. There is a worrying trend where the central government is gaining more authority. Recentralization is actually taking place in Indonesia today. The trend is evident in Omnibus Law, for example. And as the chairperson of APEC-C, I have frequently voiced my concern publicly. Our message is clear. We must not sacrifice our democracy, our local autonomy, and our unique local wisdom for the sake of economic growth and investment. And at our last national meeting of APEC in Makassar, we invite these three presidential candidates to discuss not only understanding their views on urban issues and also their commitment to the democracy, but also their plan about local autonomy. I am glad that there will be no question and answer session, so I didn't have to respond about these three candidates. So, Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, I believe local autonomy and democracy are two essential aspects if you want to achieve Indonesia Emas 2045. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pak Arya Bima, Pak Wali. Bima Arya, I'm sorry, Pak. Pak Bima Arya. It looks like the first time I met him, so mix of the name. So we have 10 minutes of Q&A, but this is off program. off program. I hope you are staying with us still. So maybe 2 questions from the audience only, not the online one. Sorry, teman-teman di online. Maybe Bu Jackie, ladies first, Pak Zulhan, maaf. Bu Jackie 1, anyone from here, from this side? Okay, cowok mungkin ya, and the back one. The lady on the back, okay. So, no, 1 female and 1 male. So we have a, Ibu Jackie, saya persilakan very...
Thank you very much, Pak Bima, for a fantastic presentation. I have to take you up on your invitation to ask about what happened at the when you talked to the presidential candidates about the future of local autonomy, and what is driving re-centralisation from your perspective as a mayor. Thank you.
Okay, the second gentleman.
Yeah, my name is Shafi Antonia from Tasca, Indonesia. My question is very direct regarding the how to fund and to enlarge the public space, and then how to invite the localities in funding the public space and particularly maintaining. For instance, we have Eco Park in Jakarta, initiated by Pak Anies, very good, excellent, but today quite disastrous.
Okay.
Number 2.
Just 1, Pak. I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Pak Arya Bima. Please.
One more question.
One more question? Okay, 1 question more extra. Oh, Mbak Lila, silakan, Mbak.
My name is Lila, and I would like to ask about some cases where it involves some local government leaders. For instance, like the Bantaing Bupati, Professor Nurdin, who then after he got elected as the governor in South Sulawesi, and then it's not just, it's just like a few years after he was elected, then he caught in corruption. And it was like to me, he was like the one of the reform leaders, very popular, but then he was still captured in the rent-seeking and corruption tradition or situation like that. What do you think about that, Pak?
Okay, thank you so much. Pak Arya Bima.
About the dilemma in managing public spaces. Yes, I have to admit that the maintenance is very crucial. It is kind of habit from the bureaucracy. We allocated the high amount of money in building, in renovating, but not for maintenance. But actually, the recipe is clear. We have to collaborate with the third party. So many project of public parks, public garden, for example, or even sport venue, we are collaborating with the third party. As long as the rule is clear, as long as it's not against the law. So we have to ensure that it is long-term maintenance. Because it is a problem within the bureaucracy in terms of the expertise and also the amount of money that we have in allocating for the maintenance. And another important issue, as it already mentioned by from Singapore, the previous speaker, Rita. Bu Rita, you are right. Yeah? The dilemma is making the public spaces accessible from anyone regarding their background. So it is quite complicated. For example, now we are renovating our alun-alun. But the problem is most of the visitors are coming not from the city of Bogor, from Tangerang Selatan, from Depok, from Bekasi. If I ask, why are you here? Because I don't have such this place at our city. So, and the background is very different. Starting from the ibu-ibu pengajian, ibu-ibu sosialita, and so on and so forth. And I have to provide something that make them comfort. And it's not easy because they're coming from different background. So making the public spaces comfort for everyone and can be accessible for anyone is not easy. That's the dilemma of the public spaces. And what is another question? Okay. If we are referring to some of local champions like Ibu Risma, Pak Ridwan Kamil, Azwar Anas, because they're maximizing the discrecy, they're maximizing the authority to do the creativity. So if we are losing that right, so that's gonna be a very big problem for local leaders. And it is also about democracy. For example, I have a deep concerns on appointing pejabat wali kota, pejabat bupati, pejabat gubernur. It is not direct elections. They don't have mandate. They don't know exactly what is going on at the grassroots level. So my concern is, if pejabat-pejabat ini sukses or consider more performance rather than elected one, so the push to return the election to DPRD will be stronger. So it is one of my concerns. So we don't want to lose the direct election because it's good for the right of citizen and for the dynamic of city leadership.
One question about the academics going to jail, Pak.
Okay. If I'm not mistaken, the case of Pak Nurdin Abdullah is also referring to what he did during the campaign election. It's about dana kampanye. I think he was trapped with the old trajectory of finding the fund for campaign and collaborating with some local vendors, some sort of things. So that's why I emphasize the importance of our independence in looking for dana kampanye. Thank you.
So we finally come to the end. Ed and I would like to thank Indonesia Project, also congratulate for the 40 years of these activities, Pak Budi, Pak Blin, and others. And of course, you all as a participants that have been staying with us over the past 2 days, and the competition between Tangsel, Bogor, Jakarta, and Bandung, and others. A very lively discussion that we have had over the past 2 years. I'm so happy, Ed and I are very happy with this discussion. And then, of course, we are thankful for the presenter that has written papers, preparing presentations on and off, and of course, especially Pak Abidin Kusno, who traveled from far away, Yogi and others. Very happy and very thankful for you all to be here. And of course, the discussion were very strict on making sure that we are on time. The discussion, everyone that has been, actively involved in this 14 Indonesia update, successful. So for the detail, thank you. Ed will, going into detail with on the names. So please, Ed.
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone who's helped to make this such a great success. I'd also particularly like to thank the sponsor, DFAT, which has been sponsoring these Indonesia Update events for a long time. The Asia Foundation also, if you notice, made a special contribution for this event. And I'd like to thank our speakers, Pak Bima in particular. It's wonderful to have you here, but all of our speakers. And I would just note for our speakers, our paper writers, as we now think of you, you're the chapter writers, actually, as we now think of you. After we close today, if you wouldn't mind just gathering at the front, and we have some special messages for you about deadlines and things like that. In addition, behind the scenes, and sometimes sort of in the front here as well, we've had a lot of people who've been working very hard to make this event so successful. In particular, there's been a group of student volunteers, postgraduates. So let me quickly name them. Alvin Febrian Basundoro, Krishna Satrio, Saraswati, Eko Sumando, Haura, who's been managing very difficult job, managing all the online questions, and Gary Rosario de Gama as well. So thank you to all our volunteers. Then there's been an amazing team from the ANU and in particular from the Indonesia project who have made for Linda and I what seems to be a very difficult, complicated task for us as conference conveners has actually made it very difficult, very easy I should say, because they've been doing so much of the work behind the scenes. So we have Lolita Morena who coordinated the volunteers. Lydia Napitupulu, who's the Indonesia projects person in Jakarta, who is of course running the Zoom and online audience from Indonesia. Nasita Anggreni, who has provided incredible support for our speakers. Alex Gotts down here, the communications and social media manager extraordinaire. And finally, the person who's sort of orchestrated the whole event, who's definitely earned a very strong cup of tea this afternoon, Catherine Whitney. So thank you very much. And now to close events, I'll hand over to Pak Budi.
I will be quick. First, let us join me to thank Pak Ed dan Ibu Amalinda for their hard work. Thank you, Ed and Bu Amalinda, for your work. But I'm still waiting for the book. Next is I would like to invite Sana Jaffrey, who will be co-convene the next year update with Eve to tell us a bit about what their plan for next year.
Thank you, Pak Budi. So next year's Indonesia update will look at 10 years of the Jokowi presidency. I will be convening it with my colleague and my friend from the Department of Political and Social Change at the ANU, Dr. Eve Warburton. We will begin with a roundup of the 2024 elections and the economic update. But the thematic portion of the update will look back at the ways in which President Jokowi has changed Indonesia. We know that President Jokowi has emerged as one of the most polarizing political figures in the post-Reformasi period. His supporters have praised his remarkable evolution from a political outsider to a formidable power broker who has pushed bold economic reform and an ambitious infrastructure agenda. But he has also been criticized, as we saw yesterday, for his government's heavy-handed measures against political opponents and efforts to realize his grand economic vision at the cost of democratic freedoms. Regardless of which side of the debate one is on, there is no denying that Jokowi has had an enduring popularity with the public, that his presidency has fundamentally transformed Indonesia by pushing its institutions to the limit, and that in doing so, he has revealed both strengths and weaknesses of Indonesia's democracy. At the 2024 update, we will convene experts from Indonesia and around the world to examine this transformation by looking at a few aspects of his presidency. We will be looking at the physical mark that Jokowi's decade has left on the country's land, forests, and infrastructure. We will look at the economic change that moved Indonesia into the upper middle income category and rewrote the terms of investments across a range of sectors. We'll look at the political shakeup during his presidency and the impact on the courts, security apparatus, and key institutions of political accountability. Finally, we'll look at the international dimension of his governance strategy and how it has affected Indonesia's global standing compared to 10 years ago. So these are the kinds of issues we'll be discussing. I hope you are able to join us next year around the same time. Thank you.
I have one more announcement. For those who already booked a lunch box, the lunch box will be provided in our tea rooms. And finally, I would like to thank all the speakers, Pak Bima and the others, for their willingness to come. And also, I would like to thank all of you who come to this update and very supportive to our activities. With that, I would like to close this update and hope to see you again next year. Thank you.